What's up? Today we're going to talk about how maneuverability works in Space Engineers and why the sci-fi staple rear thruster bank doesn't really make that much sense in Space Engineers. Now, I'll be real, there is a purpose for these rear thruster banks and I will get to them. And more importantly, Space Engineers is like 75% rule of cool and 25% PvP optimization. So regardless of the title, you guys keep doing you. I make big thruster banks for fun. You make big thruster banks for fun. Everyone makes a big thruster banks. It's like Oprah Winfrey. Everyone's getting thruster banks. But this is more of a video to illustrate how detrimental having these huge thruster banks and not understanding what it does to your ship. Because in the right hands, they're absolutely still useful, but in the wrong hands, they can really kill you. Why are these big mamba jamba thruster banks an issue? To understand that, you need to A, understand two things. The meta in Space Engineers, spin to win, and how Space Engineers velocity works. Let's start with spin to win. Now, note, we're not talking about aileron rolls where you just rotate in place. That doesn't do anything. Spin to win, or it's been gone by many other names. I've been told this has been covered by some YouTubers. I don't watch other YouTubers, so forgive my ignorance and if I repeat what they say. But in Space Engineers, you typically want to dodge incoming missiles and weapon fire, because these are usually bad for your health, and if you don't have crippling nihilism, you will try to dodge them. Actually, this explains why a lot of people don't dodge them, but in Space Engineers, the missile or turret only knows how to lead your current velocity vector, as in it sees you, and it sees where you're going, and it will try to intercept the paths. It has no understanding of trying to dodge, how to predict a human being that is a randomized travel path. It can only predict your current velocity vector and your current velocity and how to intercept a bullet with that path. So you're going straight at 100 meters per second. The turret will lead precisely how it needs to with its current missile velocity and your velocity to intercept that path. Sorry, this was pedantic, but it's important. Thus, if you shift positions, shift velocity, do anything to make it so your final position is not the final position that was calculated when the missile was fired, you will dodge it. So functionally speaking, if you can see when the missile is fired and do almost anything, you will dodge the missile. No fucking shit. However, in practice, this is much harder because you're not dodging one missile, you're usually dodging 50 missiles. So outside of a small fighter with ludicrously high delta V, dodging incoming fire manually, as in see fire, dodge fire, is very difficult. It also adds in the fact that not only are you dodging a lot of missiles, but Space Engineers missiles for some reason have a massive cone of fire, not just modded weapons, but unmodded weapons. Now you can obviously change this, but for reasons you'll see in a second, it's actually not beneficial to change that. But you're going to be dodging a cloud of missiles, so now you don't need to displace from just your ship size, you need to actually displace bigger than the cloud. Add on top of that it requires visual concentration to dodge fire. I see fire, I dodge fire. That requires a lot of concentration. It's going to be very difficult to do that and still complete objectives, as in your flight lead tells you to go tackle the ship. While I'm too busy looking at this, it gets tough. It also is tough, more importantly, to understand your velocity vector in real time, and you see this a lot with inexperienced pilots. They'll try to constantly dodge incoming fire to the point where you'll be like, hey, bro, you know you're only going like 5 meters a second. Now, where am I getting with this? The solution to this was fairly simple. Adopt a strategy that is super easy to execute that does the above with minimal brain input. Thus, the spin to win. Much like in a zigzag pattern for a naval vessel that's trying to dodge a incoming torpedo, right? Because you might not necessarily know when the torpedo is fired, but if you have a constant adjusting course, you're kind of playing a guessing game and you will dodge by default a lot of times, right? So how do we implement this strategy in Space Engineers? Well, it's super simple. You press spacebar, you hold or tap Q or E, depending on your gyro settings, and then occasionally for fun you'll press A or D, sideways thrust, to move around. If you want to go somewhere while doing this, you press W, you press S, forward and back. Super simple. But this is actually the core of Space Engineers PvP. Why? Well, by holding spacebar and holding Q, you are functionally going straight and then taking a turn. You do this aggressively enough, you're doing a loop. If you understand basic physics, you'll understand why this is really good. Let's go back. We're traveling in a straight line? Well, the turret knows how to intercept us traveling in a straight line. You turn left. All missiles fired before you turn that left will now probably miss you depending on how aggressive that left turn was. If you continuously turn left, well, now you are always changing your velocity vector, right? And if you continuously turn left, well, what you're doing is now can be described as angular velocity, as in you're doing a loop. Thus, all missiles fired at you at all times, if they were pinpoint accurate, would always by default miss you, because turrets and space engineers don't know how to predict, they only know how to intercept vectors. Once again, this doesn't play out perfectly in Space Engineers because we're not dodging point fire, we're dodging a cloud of fire, but functionally speaking, this is the easiest way to dodge most of the incoming fire. Now, why do we hold spacebar instead of holding forward? Most of it is the easiness factor. Holding Q or E and holding space is far easier to execute upon instead of holding W and trying to, with your mouse constantly lowering your nose, right? We also add in the fact that if you hold space and Q and you're looking at your enemy, which is what you're going to be doing, you prevent, typically, if you have a long ship, a much smaller profile to engage. Thus, this has been determined generally by most of the community as the easiest way to dodge incoming fire. It's the most cost-effective way in terms of brain power input and fire dodging. Now, it's worth noting, this is highly dependent on the ship, and if you don't design a ship to do this, you may end up not actually getting anything done. So if you have very low spacebar acceleration, ventral acceleration, you will actually end up just doing a massive circle because you're actually not turning very much. And from the outside looking in, it might look cool from your point of view, but for you, functionally speaking, you're taking a very slow left-hand turn. And that's still really easy to hit with your cloud of missiles. Okay, we got through that. Here's where the thruster bank part comes into play. Unlike real life, Space Engineers has a speed limit. All of your speed can always be added up and must meet the speed limit. Let's simplify it. Let's say your ship is going forward at 100 meters a second, the speed cap. We then add 1 second of thrust to port at 30 meters per second, which gives us 30 meters per second going left. We're going forward at 100, left at 30. You combined both of these two together, because we're not going in both directions at the same time, we're going in a resulting vector of these, and we get, and you can't do that in Space Engineers. So how do you fix it? Well, you don't. Space Engineers fix it. It doesn't matter if your dampeners are on or off, Space Engineers will speed brake you such that your resulting vector is always 100 meters per second. So hypothetically, if you had a thruster bank capable of 10 Gs of thrust, rounding obviously, and you were going forward at 100 meters a second and you turned left, or you thrusted left rather, you will delete your entire forward momentum and now you're going left. Now there's slightly more to it because it isn't exact how this plays out in Space Engineers, because dampening thrust does weird thing and the speed cap isn't always exactly 100 meters a second. It's super jank and weird, but mostly as a big picture thing, this is how it plays out. So hopefully you can see where I'm finally going with this. We're doing our beautiful giant circle. However, we begin thrusting forward perpendicular to our circle, and our rear massive acceleration thruster bank is actually robbing our ability to do high angular velocity turns. Now, most ships have acceptable thrust to execute on a fairly efficient spin-to-win maneuver. However, they also have these rear thruster banks. So when you slam on the gas to go forward, from your perspective, if you're not paying attention to the velocity vector, it will look great. Your rear thrusters are firing, you're closing distance with the enemy, and your bottom thrusters are firing in full, impulse, and it looks like you're doing this massive loop while going forward. However, if you zoom out, you realize your rear thruster banks have actually robbed all of your velocity of going in an angular circle, and visually from the outside, you're just doing an aileron roll, where you're spinning in place going forward, and oh my god, you just flew into a cloud of missiles and died. Today's topic isn't really saying skip these thruster banks. It's to understand the effect of thrusters in Space Engineers due to the speed limit. Now, you could get rid of the speed limit, but then functionally speaking, because of how slow missiles travel in Space Engineers, you will just SR-71 it and go faster than the missile, and it will never hit you, thus you're invulnerable due to your speed, and you don't even need the spin to win. So, people usually do this, and then they buff missile speed, and oh my god, look, we're back at square one where you need to spin to win, thus you increase the speed cap, yada yada yada. The fundamental issue always remains, with a speed cap of any kind, you will overthrust in you can, without paying attention, overthrust in a direction and kind of ruin what you think you're doing. Now, it makes sense to have thruster banks outside of just rule of cool, which is the most important rule. Well, I need to hightail it out of here and I need to leave now. Or you're pursuing a fleeing target and going full speed makes sense, right? It's okay to take some missile hits sometimes. Because dodging a missile is neat, but simply being out of range of the missile is actually the best way to dodge it. There are also situations where thruster banks are very useful, like with a ship like the Eternity, which functionally speaking is too heavy to execute on a spin-to-win tactic. Thus, instead of having thruster banks spread out everywhere, instead it has all of the thrusters in a rear, so it can rely on at least having good thrust in one direction, right? It can't spin to win, so it must rely on other techniques to dodge missiles, or sometimes just face tanking them. So a thruster bank makes a lot of sense here. Thruster banks make sense everywhere. It's just important to understand if you have a lot of thrust in one direction, because Space Engineers doesn't have variable thrust, at least not on your keyboard, it's very easy to overthrust and just ruin your dodging technique. But yeah, I want to keep this one short. Too many of my videos are getting a little too long, so yeah, let's keep this one short. Thanks for watching. Hopefully for you this was useful. I know a lot of people actually understand this, but I know for a fact, judging by how many people just spin in place, don't understand this. Hopefully the time you spent watching this was value added for you. Maybe it wasn't. Anyways, thanks for watching.